I was exhausted after finishing my second shift at the diner when my grandmother suddenly walked in, staring at me in shock. She asked one simple question that froze my blood. "Why aren't you using the trust your parents left you?" I thought she was confused, until the family lawyer standing behind her suddenly turned pale. Callan Whitmore was used to living on exhaustion. At 27, his life moved between two places: the cold, noisy warehouse where he worked during the day, and the small roadside diner where he served coffee and late-night meals to truck drivers and tired travelers. Most mornings began before sunrise and ended well after midnight. Sleep came in short, restless hours, but Callan had long accepted that this was simply how his life had to be. He lived in a cramped one-bedroom apartment on the edge of Richford, Ohio. The paint on the walls was chipped, the carpet was worn thin, and the old heater rattled loudly every winter night. Still, it was the only place he could afford after rent, utilities, and groceries took nearly everything he earned. Every week felt like a careful balancing act, making sure there was just enough money left to survive until the next paycheck. Ever since he was 16, Callan had believed his family left him nothing but problems. His parents had died suddenly in a car accident on a rainy highway, and the tragedy had shattered what little stability he had known. After that, his uncle Tobias Whitmore stepped in as his legal guardian. Tobias always explained the same story whenever money was mentioned. Callan's parents had been drowning in debt before they died. According to him, the accident only made things worse. Callan never had any reason to question it. He trusted his uncle, believing that Tobias had sacrificed a lot just to take him in. The idea that there might have been anything left behind for him never crossed his mind. So he worked. He worked through aching muscles, long nights, and endless bills, believing that struggle was simply the life his parents had unknowingly left him. What he didn't know was that the truth about his past had been carefully hidden from him for more than a decade. For most of Callan Whitmore's life, the diner had been nothing more than a second job. But on that rainy Thursday evening, it became the place where everything he believed about his life started to unravel. The storm outside had turned the streets of Richford, Ohio into shining rivers of reflected streetlights. Inside the diner, the air smelled of coffee, grilled onions, and warm pancakes. Callan moved slowly between the tables, his shoulders heavy with exhaustion after finishing his warehouse shift only an hour earlier. His uniform apron was slightly wrinkled, and the dark circles under his eyes told the story of years spent pushing through fatigue. The dinner rush had already faded, leaving only a few quiet customers scattered around the room. Callan was wiping down the counter when the bell above the entrance door rang. He barely looked up at first. "Table for one?" he asked automatically, still focused on cleaning. But the silence that followed made him glance toward the door. An elderly woman stood there, holding the handle as rain dripped softly from her umbrella. Her silver hair was neatly styled, and she wore a long navy coat that looked far too elegant for the small roadside diner. Her eyes were fixed directly on him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Callan felt a strange sense of familiarity he couldn't immediately place. The woman slowly stepped inside, her expression shifting from uncertainty to disbelief. She studied his face carefully, as if confirming something she had almost been afraid to believe. "Callan?" she said quietly. The sound of his name made his stomach tighten. He hadn't heard that voice in years, but suddenly the memories returned all at once. "Grandma." "Eleanor," he said, stunned. It had been more than a decade since he had seen his grandmother. After his parents died, she had gradually disappeared from his life, and Tobias had always brushed off questions about her by saying she had moved away and wanted privacy. Now she was standing in front of him. But instead of smiling, Eleanor Whitmore looked deeply confused. Her eyes slowly moved over his apron, the worn shoes on his feet, and the tired way he stood behind the counter. The longer she looked, the more troubled her expression became. It was as if something about what she was seeing made absolutely no sense to her at all. Callan led Eleanor to a quiet booth near the window, still trying to process the shock of seeing her again after so many years. Rain slid down the glass beside them, blurring the dim lights of the street outside. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Callan placed a cup of coffee in front of her out of habit, though his hands moved a little slower than usual. His mind was racing with questions he didn't even know how to ask. "I didn't know you were still in Richford," he said carefully. Uncle Tobias told me you moved away years ago. Eleanor's eyebrows pulled together slightly, as if that statement alone was strange. But she didn't comment on it yet. Instead, she studied Callan more closely. The tired lines around his eyes, the diner uniform, the faint grease stains on his sleeve. You work here? She asked gently. Night shift, Callan replied with a small shrug. Warehouse during the day. The answer seemed to hit her harder than he expected. Her confusion slowly turned into something deeper, almost disbelief. 2 jobs, she asked. Callan nodded. Yeah. It's not so bad once you get used to it. But Eleanor leaned back in the booth, staring at him as if he had just said something completely impossible. For several seconds she said nothing, her fingers resting quietly around the coffee cup. Then she asked the question that would shatter everything Callan thought he knew. Callan, why aren't you using the trust? He blinked. The trust? He repeated. The one your parents left you, Eleanor said slowly, as if the answer should have been obvious. Callan felt his chest tighten. I don't know what you're talking about. Now it was Eleanor's turn to look stunned. There was a trust fund, she said firmly. Your parents set it up before they died. It was meant to support you until you were fully on your feet. Callan shook his head, confused. My parents didn't leave anything, he said. Uncle Tobias told me they were buried in debt. The moment those words left his mouth, Eleanor's face changed completely. Confusion turned into something far more serious. Something was wrong. Very wrong. Eleanor didn't speak for several seconds after Callan finished explaining what he had been told all these years. She sat very still in the diner booth, her fingers tightening slightly around the coffee cup. The calm confusion on her face slowly hardened into something more focused, almost alarmed. Callan, she said carefully, who told you that your parents left nothing? My uncle Tobias, Callan replied without hesitation. After the accident, he said they had debts everywhere. Loans, credit cards, everything. He told me there wasn't anything left. Eleanor slowly shook her head. That's impossible. The certainty in her voice made Callan uneasy. He had lived with Tobias's explanation for more than 10 years. It had always sounded believable. Life had been difficult for his parents before the accident, or at least that was what Tobias claimed. But now Eleanor was looking at him as if the story made no sense at all. Your parents were extremely careful with money, she continued. Before they died, they created a trust specifically for you. I remember sitting in the lawyer's office when they signed the papers. Callan felt a knot forming in his stomach. A trust? He said quietly. Yes, Eleanor replied firmly. A very large one. The words hung in the air between them. Callan suddenly felt like the room had grown smaller. None of this matched the life he had been living. If something like that truly existed, then why had he spent years working himself nearly to exhaustion just to survive? Eleanor pulled a phone from her purse and dialed a number. There's only one way to settle this, she said. A short time later, the diner door opened again. A tall man in a gray suit stepped inside, water dripping from his umbrella. His name was Miles Carraway, the attorney who had handled the Whitmore family's estate years earlier. When Miles approached the booth, Eleanor immediately explained the situation. Callan says he's never received anything from the trust his parents created, she said. For a moment, Miles simply stared at Callan. The color slowly drained from his face. You never received it? He asked quietly. Callan shook his head, and the lawyer suddenly looked as though something terrible had just been discovered. Miles Carraway slowly lowered himself into the booth across from Callan, his expression still pale. For a man who had spent decades handling complicated legal matters, he suddenly looked deeply unsettled. That shouldn't be possible, Miles said quietly, almost to himself. Callan's stomach tightened. The way the lawyer spoke made it clear that something serious had been uncovered. Eleanor leaned forward, her voice firm. Miles, tell him the truth. His parents created a trust, didn't they? Miles nodded slowly. Yes, they did. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a slim folder he had brought with him. It contained copies of documents he still kept from older family cases. As he opened it on the table, Callan felt his heart pounding harder with every passing second. Your parents established the trust about 6 months before the accident, Miles explained. They wanted to make sure you would always be taken care of if anything ever happened to them. Callan stared at the papers spread across the table. How much was in it? He asked carefully. Miles hesitated for a moment before answering. A little over $4 million at the time it was created. The words hit Callan like a sudden shock. $4 million. He had spent years struggling to afford rent, skipping meals, and working himself through endless nights. While that kind of money had supposedly been meant to support him, that money was placed under the control of your legal guardian until you reached adulthood, Miles continued. The guardian responsible for managing it was listed as Tobias Whitmore. Callan slowly looked up. My uncle. Miles nodded again, his expression growing darker as he flipped through several pages. There were withdrawals over the years, he said, scanning the records. Guardians are allowed to use portions of trust funds for the child's living expenses, education, and well-being. Callan felt a flicker of relief. Maybe there was a reasonable explanation. But then Miles turned another page. And another. His brows tightened. These withdrawals, he murmured. What about them? Eleanor asked sharply. Miles looked up at them both. The amounts are far too large, he said quietly. How large? Callan asked. Miles slid the document across the table. The total was staggering. Hundreds of thousands of dollars withdrawn over the years. Callan's voice came out barely above a whisper. I never saw any of that. Eleanor's expression hardened with cold anger. And Miles finally spoke the truth neither of them wanted to hear. It appears, he said carefully, that someone has been using your trust fund for something other than your benefit. Callan stared at the numbers on the document, as if they were written in a language he couldn't understand. The rows of withdrawals blurred together, each one larger than the last. Hundreds of thousands of dollars had been taken from the trust over the years, money that was supposedly meant to secure his future. Yet his reality had been completely different. He remembered nights when he had skipped dinner because he couldn't afford groceries. Winters when he kept the heater turned off to save on electricity. Years of working double shifts just to keep his small apartment. None of it made sense anymore. You're telling me that money was there the entire time? Callan asked quietly. Miles Carraway nodded grimly. Yes. Eleanor leaned closer to the table, her voice shaking with anger. And Tobias was responsible for managing it. That's correct, Miles replied. Callan's mind raced through memories of his uncle. Tobias had always acted strict but responsible, often reminding Callan how difficult it had been to raise him after his parents died. He constantly spoke about sacrifices and how the family had barely survived financially. Now every one of those conversations felt like a lie. Miles turned several more pages, carefully reviewing the financial history. Guardians are legally allowed to withdraw funds for necessary expenses, he explained. But those withdrawals must clearly benefit the child. He tapped the document again. These transactions don't look like normal support expenses. What do they look like? Eleanor asked sharply. Miles sighed before answering. They look like personal spending. Callan felt a wave of cold realization spread through his chest. All the years he had struggled, while someone else was quietly using the money meant for him. Eleanor suddenly spoke with firm determination. We need to see exactly where that money went. Miles nodded slowly. That's the next step. If Tobias used the trust improperly, there will be a financial trail. Callan looked down at the papers one more time. The life he believed he understood was beginning to crumble piece by piece. And the man he had trusted most might have been the one responsible for stealing his entire future. Eleanor Whitmore sat in silence for a long moment after Miles finished explaining the suspicious withdrawals. The quiet diner suddenly felt heavy with tension. Outside, the rain continued to fall against the windows, but inside the booth the atmosphere had turned cold. Callan could see the anger slowly building behind his grandmother's calm expression. Tobias promised me he would protect you, she finally said, her voice low but steady. Callan looked up, confused. You talked to him about it? Of course I did, Eleanor replied. After your parents died, we all met with Miles. Tobias assured me he would manage the trust carefully and make sure you had every opportunity your parents wanted for you. Her eyes hardened. I trusted him. Miles quietly added. At the time, Tobias appeared responsible. There was no legal reason to question the arrangement. He was your closest living relative and your appointed guardian. Callan felt a knot forming in his chest. All those years, he had believed Tobias was helping him out of kindness. The man constantly reminded him how expensive it had been to raise a teenager after the accident. Tobias often talked about the burden he had taken on. But now it sounded different. Now it sounded like manipulation. Eleanor leaned forward, her voice growing sharper. Callan, did Tobias ever use that money for your education? Did he help you start a business? Did he pay for anything that improved your future? Callan slowly shook his head. No, he said quietly. I started working at 16. He said if I wanted anything, I had to earn it. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, trying to control the anger rising inside her. That money was meant to give you a chance, she said. Your parents wanted you to have freedom, to study, to build a life without struggling. Callan looked down at the table. Instead, he had spent more than a decade fighting just to survive. Miles flipped through another document in the folder and spoke again. There's something else, he said. Both of them looked at him. The withdrawals weren't random, Miles continued. They increased every year. What does that mean? Callan asked. Miles met his eyes with a serious expression. It means Tobias didn't just misuse the trust once or twice, he said. He built his entire lifestyle around it. The next morning, the small conference room inside Miles Carraway's law office was filled with stacks of documents, bank statements, and financial reports. What had started as a simple question in a diner the night before had now turned into a serious investigation. Callan sat quietly at the long wooden table, still trying to absorb the truth unfolding in front of him. Eleanor sat beside him, her posture straight and determined, while Miles reviewed the records one by one. Financial trails never disappear, Miles explained as he adjusted his glasses. Every transfer, every withdrawal, every purchase leaves a record somewhere. He slid another document across the table. This is the trust account history. Callan leaned forward. The pages showed years of transactions, money being pulled from the trust in steady, calculated amounts. At first the withdrawals were small, but over time they became larger and more frequent. What was he spending it on? Eleanor asked coldly. Miles opened another folder. That's what we're confirming now. Inside were records connected to Tobias Whitmore's personal accounts. As the papers were spread across the table, the pattern slowly became clear. Large deposits from the trust had been transferred directly into Tobias's accounts. From there, the money had funded a lifestyle Callan had never even imagined. A house purchase, 8 years ago, Miles said, pointing to one record. Callan's eyes widened. Tobias bought that big house outside town, he said quietly. He told me he had been saving for years. Miles shook his head. Not according to these records. Another document appeared. A luxury vehicle paid in full. Callan remembered the expensive SUV Tobias drove. He had always assumed his uncle had simply done well financially. But now every memory carried a different meaning. Miles continued flipping through pages. Investment accounts. Vacation properties. Private club memberships. Each item painted a clearer picture. Tobias hadn't just taken small amounts. He had systematically drained the trust over the years while Callan struggled to survive. Eleanor's voice grew firm. We need to confront him. Miles nodded slowly. With this evidence, we can. Callan looked at the documents covering the table. For the first time, the full weight of the betrayal became real. The man who raised him hadn't just lied. He had quietly built his entire life using the money meant for Callan's future. Later that afternoon, Callan sat in the passenger seat of Miles Carraway's car as they drove toward the wealthiest neighborhood on the outskirts of Richford. Eleanor sat in the back seat, silent but tense. None of them had spoken much during the drive. Callan stared out the window as the houses around them grew larger and more expensive. Perfect lawns, tall iron gates, and wide driveways lined the quiet streets. It felt like a completely different world from the small apartment he had struggled to afford for years. Finally, the car slowed in front of a large 2-story house with stone walls and tall windows. Miles glanced at the address on his phone. This is it, he said. Callan looked at the house carefully. He had visited it a few times over the years, but only briefly. Tobias had always acted as if it were the result of years of careful savings and business success. Now Callan knew something very different. They stepped out of the car and walked up the long driveway. Eleanor knocked firmly on the front door. A moment later, Tobias Whitmore opened it. He looked exactly as Callan remembered, confident, well-dressed, and slightly annoyed at the unexpected visit. "Callan," Tobias said with surprise. "What are you doing here?" Then he noticed Eleanor and Miles standing behind him. His expression tightened slightly. "Well, this is unexpected," he said, forcing a polite smile. "What's going on?" Eleanor didn't waste time. "We need to talk about Callan's trust fund." The words hit the air like a sudden crack of thunder. For just a split second, Tobias froze. But then he laughed lightly and stepped aside. "Oh, that old thing," he said casually. "There's nothing to discuss. The money was mostly used for Callan's expenses while he was growing up." Callan felt anger rising in his chest. "My expenses?" he repeated. "I started working when I was 16. Tobias shrugged. "Life isn't cheap." That was when Miles stepped forward and handed him a thick folder. "Then perhaps you can explain these transactions," Miles said calmly. Tobias opened the folder. At first his confident expression remained, but as he scanned the pages, the color slowly began draining from his face. The smile disappeared. And for the first time, Tobias Whitmore looked nervous. Tobias's hands trembled slightly as he flipped through the thick folder Miles had handed him. Each page held a record of withdrawals, transfers, and expenses tied directly to Callan's trust fund. Transactions that clearly showed money meant for Callan's future had been siphoned off to fund Tobias's lifestyle. He tried to mask his panic with a forced laugh. These are just minor accounting errors," he stammered. "You know how complicated these things can get." Eleanor's eyes blazed with anger. "Minor errors? Tobias, these aren't mistakes. You've taken hundreds of thousands of dollars meant for Callan. You lied to him for years." Callan felt a surge of fury that had been building for over a decade. Every late night, every skipped meal, every exhausted morning, his entire life of struggle, was now revealed to have been stolen from him by the one person he was supposed to trust the most. Miles leaned closer to Tobias, his voice calm but cutting. "The evidence is clear. The courts will see these records exactly as they are. Using a trust fund for personal gain is a serious violation of fiduciary duty. You've committed fraud." Tobias's confident facade crumbled. His face went pale, and for the first time in years he looked powerless. He had spent so long manipulating the system, hiding behind legal loopholes and trust, but now the walls of his deception were collapsing around him. Eleanor stepped forward, her voice firm and unwavering. "You stole from your own family, Tobias. From Callan. And now karma is catching up." Callan finally spoke, his voice low but steady. "You called me ungrateful, told me I had nothing, forced me to work 2 jobs just to survive. All while you were living off what was mine. Now I'm taking it back." Tobias opened his mouth to reply, but no words came. The silence in the room was deafening. The man who had once wielded control over Callan's life now faced the consequences of his betrayal. For the first time, justice wasn't just a word, it was unfolding right before Callan's eyes. For the first time, justice wasn't just a word, it was unfolding right before Callan's eyes. The court proceedings moved swiftly once the evidence was submitted. Callan, Eleanor, and Miles watched from the gallery as Tobias Whitmore sat on the other side, his once confident demeanor replaced by anxiety and unease. The judge went through the documents methodically, noting every suspicious withdrawal and unauthorized transaction from the trust fund. Tobias tried to defend himself, claiming that the money had been used for Callan's well-being, but the evidence was undeniable. Luxury cars, expensive vacations, and private investments, all purchased with the trust meant for Callan, were laid bare. Each item was a striking illustration of years of betrayal. The judge's gavel struck sharply. "It is clear that Mr. Tobias Whitmore abused his fiduciary responsibility," the judge said firmly. "All assets acquired through misappropriation of the trust will be returned to the beneficiary, Callan Whitmore. Further legal action and criminal charges may follow." Callan felt a strange mixture of vindication and lingering pain. Years of struggle, humiliation, and exhaustion had been built on a lie. But now the truth was finally coming to light. Eleanor squeezed his hand, silently showing her pride and support. Within weeks, the remaining trust funds and properties purchased by Tobias were returned to Callan. He reclaimed everything that had been stolen from him. The money that could have eased his life long ago, the investments that could have secured his future, and the homes that were rightfully his. Tobias Whitmore, once so controlling and self-assured, now faced criminal charges and financial ruin. Friends and neighbors who had admired his supposed success now looked at him with suspicion and disbelief. The man who had once mocked Callan for his hard work and lack of inheritance was exposed as a fraud. Callan finally allowed himself to breathe. He was no longer a victim. He was reclaiming the life that had been stolen, piece by piece, and watching karma unfold in real time. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of freedom. Months later, Callan stood on the balcony of his new apartment, sunlight spilling across the city skyline. The weight of years spent working double shifts and struggling to survive had finally lifted. Beside him, Eleanor Whitmore smiled warmly, her presence a steady reminder of family, trust, and resilience. The betrayal he endured had cut deep. Tobias Whitmore, the man who was supposed to protect him, had stolen not just money, but time, energy, and the sense of security that every child deserves. Callan often reflected on the exhaustion, the long nights, and the meals he skipped, all for a future that had been within reach all along. But now justice had been served. Tobias had lost his wealth, reputation, and freedom. The courtroom had not only returned what was rightfully Callan's, but it had exposed the depth of deception that had shaped his life. Karma had done its work, proving that betrayal, no matter how calculated, could never go unpunished. Callan had learned that strength comes not only from surviving hardship, but from reclaiming one's truth. He invested the trust carefully, built his life on his own terms, and finally allowed himself to dream again. The anger that had once burned hot was replaced by a quiet determination and an unwavering sense of fairness. Eleanor placed a hand on his shoulder. "Your parents wanted you to have a life full of opportunity," she said softly. "Not a life stolen from you by someone else." Callan nodded, feeling a deep sense of closure. He had fought for what was his, endured the betrayal of blood, and emerged victorious. The lesson was clear. Lies can steal years, but truth and perseverance have the power to restore everything. Betrayal may scar, but revenge tempered by justice can heal. And sometimes, the hardest battles yield the sweetest victories.
Some stories don't end, they follow you. If this one stayed in your mind, you know what to do.